This is China, a country with an enormous number of executions that take place every year. See for yourself. Researchers estimate that somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 people are executed under the law each year. And here's the really surprising part. To make sense of it, let's head to China's capital, Beijing. See those vehicles? Each one is transporting a person who's been sentenced to death. And it doesn't matter where they're headed, the execution will be carried out right inside the vehicle. These are so-called execution vans. And yes, that's as strange as it sounds. So let's zoom out and look at China from above. The country has more than 650 prisons spread across nearly the entire territory of the PRC, from the densely populated Beijing area all the way to the remote reaches of Inner Mongolia. Together, they employ more than 100,000 staff members. So isn't that enough to carry out executions there instead of in vans? In reality, for China, these execution vans became a cost-saving solution. They also helped supply organs. It's an incredibly complicated story, and that's exactly what we're going to look into today. An execution van sounds deeply sinister, but how could a regular vehicle even be used for something like that? It clearly isn't built for such a purpose, but the reality's not what people usually imagine. No one just grabs a random van from a parking lot. Specialized companies such as Jingwan Auto take a standard vehicle and completely rebuild it for this specific use. Picture this. The rear doors open, and inside there's nothing familiar at all. No seats, no normal passenger compartment. Instead, there's a sealed medical capsule, fully separated from the driver's area and the escort section. It's a self-contained space where everything has been carefully designed down to the smallest detail. At the heart of the system is an automated injection unit. It's operated remotely and delivers the drugs according to a fixed protocol. No manual handling, no improvisation. All of it's meant to minimize the risk of human error. The interior walls are lined with sound dampening and antiseptic materials. Cameras and medical monitors track the condemned person's condition throughout the process. Essentially, the van contains an entire technological system. A judge or prosecutor can observe what's happening on monitors from a separate compartment at the front of the vehicle. They can see everything inside the capsule while remaining physically isolated from it. This is also the point where it makes sense to talk about what these vehicles look like from the outside. A lot of people probably expect something, well, sinister. Some special body design, huge warning labels, maybe even official symbols. But in reality, it's much more mundane. From the outside, it's basically an ordinary van. Sometimes black, sometimes white. It may have flashing lights on top, and that's about it. To anyone watching, it looks like just another government service vehicle you'd see on the road every day. But shouldn't everyone immediately know? That's an execution van, let it through. Actually, no, that's exactly what nobody wants. On the contrary, the whole system depends on staying as inconspicuous as possible. Imagine a vehicle driving through the city with bright markings or a bizarre body shape. What would happen? People would start taking photos, gathering around it. Someone would stage a protest, and reporters would make a huge story out of it within minutes. That's why authorities use standard production vans, such as models made by Ford or Iveco. On the outside, they're no different from thousands of other vehicles on the road, and that becomes especially useful in certain cases. Here's, for example, Liu Yang, the leader of an organized crime group who was executed in one of these vehicles. Yuan Baojing, a prominent businessman, was also executed in a mobile unit in 2006 after receiving a suspended death sentence, and that was no coincidence. There are situations when someone might try to save powerful people from punishment. But in this case, where exactly would anyone pull the person from? It's just an ordinary-looking service vehicle driving down the street. No one can attack every such van on the off chance that a defendant is inside. That simply wouldn't work. There's also another practical reason. A civilian-looking exterior allows the vehicle to use ordinary infrastructure, roads, gas stations, and repair services, without road closures, extra scrutiny, or unnecessary attention to its route. But that raises an obvious question. Why make vehicles like this in the first place? Didn't China already have enough prisons to carry out executions? At first glance, it certainly did. More than enough, in fact. Let's look at the map. Here's China. Now let's plot its prisons. It would look something like this. And even then, there would still be too few dots, because if we tried to show every single one, the map would end up almost completely filled. By various estimates, the country has around 680 to 700 prisons spread across every province, from the densely populated eastern coast to the remote western regions. Those facilities hold roughly 1.6 to 1.7 million inmates, and the system's run by hundreds of thousands of staff. In sheer scale, it's one of the largest prison systems in the world, comparable to the one in the United States. And here's the most interesting part. Historically, executions in China were carried out right next to these prisons. A condemned prisoner usually was not taken to some separate execution center. The sentence was carried out either inside the prison grounds or at a specially designated site nearby. In the case of execution by firearm, no elaborate infrastructure was needed at all. A few staff members, a weapon, and a doctor to pronounce death, and the procedure was over. Which is exactly why the whole situation seems so strange. There were plenty of prisons, plenty of space, and the procedure itself was technically quite simple. So why then did the country need these so-called execution vans? Now let's jump back in time a bit to a very different part of the world. In the early 1980s in Texas, the first execution by lethal injection was carried out in the United States. To many countries, it seemed like a new, more civilized way to carry out a death sentence. It looked like a medical procedure. China took notice as well. Chinese officials looked at the American practice and came to a fairly straightforward conclusion. If this method appeared more humane, then perhaps it was worth adopting at home, too. The first officially recorded use of lethal injection in China took place in 1997 in the city of Kunming. It was essentially treated as an experiment. The procedure was carried out, it worked, and on paper, the trial was considered successful. But almost immediately, officials ran into a much more down-to-earth issue: costs. Carrying out executions by injection required specialized infrastructure, medical equipment, dedicated rooms, and monitoring systems. In other words, each prison would have had to either completely retrofit existing facilities or build a separate execution unit from scratch. And now think about the scale of the system. Hundreds of prisons across the country. Can you imagine how much that would cost? The projected expenses were enormous. That was when Chinese engineers came up with a solution that was at once highly practical and deeply grim. That's how the idea of mobile execution chambers emerged. Specially designed vans that serve the same purpose as a permanent execution block inside a prison, only on wheels. Each vehicle cost around $60,000 to $70,000, which, compared with constructing separate facilities, seemed almost cheap. But cost wasn't the only reason, because the people carrying out the execution also suffer less damage. Emotional damage. China's traditional method of execution by gunshot was always an extreme burden for the people tasked with carrying it out. It meant direct contact with the condemned person, the sound of the shot, the smell of gunpowder. Experiences like that rarely leave no mark. Over time, many executioners developed serious psychological problems. That eventually forced the state to confront an uncomfortable question. If the system keeps requiring people to do this for years, what happens to the people inside the system? Sooner or later, the damage spreads. Depression, burnout, emotional breakdowns. Some kind of distance had to be created between the individual and the most traumatic part of the process. And that's where mobile execution vans turned out to be an unexpected, practical solution. But that raises another question. How exactly do they make things easier on the conscience of the people involved? After all, a lethal injection still ends a person's life. The answer lies in how the human role in the process changes. Once the execution takes place inside a van, it starts to resemble a medical procedure. The employee is no longer standing in front of someone with a weapon in hand. Instead, he sits at a control panel, presses a button, watches the monitors, and makes sure everything follows protocol. Psychologically, that shift can be very effective. Responsibility seems to dissolve across a whole chain of participants: the pharmacologists who develop the drugs, the engineers who design the equipment, the automated system that delivers the injection. The executioner becomes only one part of a larger machine. In his own mind, he's no longer taking a life. He's supervising the operation of a complex system. It creates a kind of emotional distance. Technology, protocols, and manuals stand between the individual and the final outcome, and for many employees, that's enough to make what's happening feel less like an act of violence and more like the performance of an official duty. Was that alone enough to push the system toward choosing execution vans? Absolutely. But that's not where the story ends, because at that point, another very simple factor comes into play: logistics. China's enormous. And not just in the sense that it looks big on a map, it is genuinely vast. Mountain regions, remote counties, entire provinces where the nearest major city can be hundreds of miles away, and not every one of those places has the technical capacity to maintain a fully equipped modern execution facility. That's exactly why the mobility of these vans became such a decisive advantage. Essentially, the government could bring a fully equipped medical unit straight to the place where the sentence was issued with everything already in place. But that raises an obvious question: is it really worth it? Why not simply transport the condemned prisoner to the nearest large city? In practice, it's far more complicated than it sounds. Moving someone sentenced to death is a major logistical operation. It requires heavy security, sealed routes, and coordination across multiple jurisdictions. Any trip lasting dozens or even hundreds of miles through several provinces creates immediate risks: an attack on the convoy, an escape attempt, a crash, or any other incident that could instantly turn into a major scandal for local officials. The vans remove much of that burden. The procedure can be carried out right next to a local courthouse or detention center. The vehicle arrives, does its job, and leaves. For the system, that means one key thing: everything works quickly and without unnecessary transport complications, even in the most remote areas where building a separate facility would make little sense. And that leads to another question. Shouldn't international human rights organizations have strong objections to a system like this? It would seem like exactly the kind of practice they would strongly condemn. And in fact, they do. Their criticism is serious. More than that, many human rights advocates believe the official explanations, convenience, cost savings, and logistics may tell only part of the story. In their view, the real purpose of these execution vans may be something else entirely. There's a practice called organ donation, and according to some sources, executed prisoners in China have often ended up as donors. But organ donation has one major problem: time. Because once the heart stops, organs begin to deteriorate very quickly and can soon become unusable for transplantation. And this is where that same van comes to the rescue. At that point, it's no longer just a mobile execution chamber, it's a sterile operating room on wheels, able to arrive directly at the site of the procedure. The moment the monitors confirm cardiac arrest, the medical team inside can move immediately. No transporting the body across the city, no costly delays. The vehicle already contains everything needed: a sterile environment, cooling systems, and medical equipment. That makes it possible to recover organs during the so-called golden hour, the brief window when they have the highest medical value for transplantation. Essentially, the van begins to function like a high-tech transport system. The organs are quickly prepared and then rushed to hospitals. But this raises a serious question. On what legal basis can the state dispose of its citizens' bodies on such a scale? The answer goes back into history. In 1984, China adopted a document called the Temporary Rules Concerning the Utilization of Corpses or Organs from the Corpses of Executed Criminals. For many years, it remained classified, but its existence later became public. The document allowed the bodies of executed prisoners to be used for scientific purposes. For example, if relatives didn't claim the body or if the condemned person had given consent. And this is where the core controversy begins. Human rights advocates ask a simple but deeply uncomfortable question. Can consent really be considered voluntary when it comes from someone sitting on death row? Critics of the system argue that this legal framework effectively created the conditions for a vast black market. In their view, the punishment system may have been transformed into a kind of resource pipeline for medicine. The government, however, insists that prisoners are not the main source of organs, so why not simply prove it? In theory, that should be possible, or at least worth trying. But convincing human rights groups has turned out to be extremely difficult, because they have one argument they treat as almost a mathematical trump card. Even in countries with strong voluntary donor programs, transplant patients often wait a long time. Sometimes a very long time. In Europe and the United States, the wait for a kidney transplant can easily stretch to 2 or 3 years, and sometimes even longer. Liver transplants are a bit faster, but people still often wait for months. Why is that? Because organ availability is unpredictable. No one can say in advance when a donor with the right blood type, the right age, and compatible tissue will appear. In most cases, it comes down to chance. Knowing that, the situation in China looks, to put it mildly, unusual. Investigative journalists and independent commissions reported that some clinics claimed they could find a matching organ in just 1 or 2 weeks. In some cases, even within a few days. That's exactly what drew the attention of an independent international tribunal investigating allegations connected to China's transplant system. In its findings, the panel stated plainly, such short waiting times are hard to reconcile with a system based solely on voluntary donations after natural death. They concluded that organs could be matched that quickly only if there were a special bank of potential living donors who'd already been screened and matched to recipients in advance. In other words, people whose deaths had effectively been arranged to serve the needs of transplantation. But was that the worst part of the story? Sadly, no. Researchers found evidence suggesting that people inside those vans may not have been dying from injections at all. How could that be possible? The explanation they put forward is both simple and deeply disturbing. A group of researchers reviewed 71 scientific papers published in Chinese medical journals. Those papers described organ procurement procedures, and the researchers concluded that, in some cases, organs may have been removed from people who had not yet been formally declared dead. In other words, the situation may have looked like this. The heart could still be beating, the lungs could still be working, and the organ removal itself became the actual cause of death. In that version of events, the roles changed dramatically. The doctors involved in the procedure formally remain medical professionals, but in practice, it's their actions that become the very moment when a person's life ends. And that gives the so-called execution vans an even more horrifying meaning in the eyes of human rights advocates. Not just a mobile chamber for lethal injection, but a mobile system designed to provide rapid access to organs where every condemned prisoner is turned into a resource for the transplant industry. And that leaves me with one final question. How did the Chinese government ultimately respond to all of these accusations? In response, the Chinese authorities decided to take a far more drastic approach. Instead of addressing each case or each transport van one by one, the government announced a sweeping reform. In 2015, officials formally declared that organs from executed prisoners would no longer be used. From that point on, the only legal source of transplant organs was supposed to be voluntary donations from ordinary citizens. To oversee the process, they even created a separate allocation system, the China Organ Transplant Response System, or simply COTRS. Its purpose was to centrally track donated organs and distribute them among hospitals in order to eliminate informal or backdoor arrangements. On paper, it looked like a complete overhaul of China's entire transplant system. But there was one important catch. That 1984 document allowing the use of organs from prisoners never formally disappeared. It remained in place, which meant that, legally, the use of prisoners' organs could still be justified if consent had supposedly been given. That's exactly why some researchers believe the reform may have changed the system while also leaving it almost untouched. The wording changed and the accounting methods changed, and that's it. And this is where one possible explanation comes in. China genuinely has very few voluntary donors. Consider this. By the end of 2022, about 6.5 million people in China had registered as willing to donate their organs after death. The country has a population of 1.4 billion people. That works out to only about 4 registered donors per million. That's many times lower than in other developed countries, where the figure typically exceeds 30 to 40 per million. Which naturally raises the question, why are there so few people in the country willing to donate their organs after death? It largely comes down to certain deeply rooted aspects of traditional Chinese culture. Broadly speaking, Chinese people are not especially religious. In fact, according to surveys, roughly 90% of the population does not identify with any religion at all. But there's an important nuance here. Even if someone does not consider themselves religious, they may still live within a cultural tradition shaped over centuries. And in China, that tradition remains deeply influenced by Confucianism. That influence creates a major barrier to organ donation. In Confucian ethics, there's a simple but powerful idea. A person's body is a gift from their parents. Skin, bones, even hair, all of it is inherited from one's ancestors. To damage the body voluntarily is seen as a sign of disrespect. That's why for many Chinese people, the very idea that the body might be taken apart for organs after death can feel almost sacrilegious. Tradition points to a very different ending. The body should return to the earth as whole as possible, without injury, so as not to disturb the harmony between the individual, their ancestors, and the afterlife. On top of that cultural layer, there's also everyday superstition. In Chinese society, talking about death is still widely seen as bad luck. People tend to avoid the subject in ordinary life, so signing a donor card may be viewed not as a noble act, but as something strange or even dangerous. Why seal your own fate ahead of time? Why tempt fate at all? But are Confucian values and superstition the only reasons people hesitate to become donors? Or are there more modern causes behind this widespread distrust of the system? Aren't ordinary citizens also aware that the system itself is seen as rather non-transparent? They are, and that has a powerful effect as well. Some people genuinely fear that if they officially register as donors, doctors might not fight for their lives all the way in a critical situation. The logic is simple and disturbing. If your organs are already in the system, then someone else may be waiting for them. Add to that years of rumors about black market transplant surgeons, the so-called execution vans, strange stories of people disappearing, and investigative reporting, and it becomes easy to see why persuading the public that the organ allocation system is fully transparent is so difficult. All in all, when it comes to organ procurement, this is a very complicated story, full of myths, outside research, and unanswered questions. China is, after all, a very closed country. Still, if we're talking about execution vans as a solution to logistical and economic challenges, they do in fact solve those problems.